What is a human life worth? 12 cents. Less than a cup of coffee, less than a single bullet. But this isn't just a story about slavery. It's a story that was erased because it revealed something even darker. A woman sold while carrying her master's child. A transaction so obscene that even other slave traders called it unnatural. The year was 1838. The place, Milledgeville, Georgia. And somewhere in the damp air of that auction house, a question still hangs. Why was a pregnant woman sold for 12 cents? And why did both she and her baby vanish from every record that followed? The year was 1838, a time when America was expanding, inventing, and idealizing freedom. Yet beneath that surface of progress lay one of the darkest economic machines ever constructed by human hands, the Southern slave trade. In Georgia, the air was thick with heat and hypocrisy. The state's wealth flowed not from innovation or industry, but from bodies, men, women, and children whose existence had been converted into assets. Every birth added to someone's fortune. Every death was a loss to be written off. It was in this atmosphere that an auction took place so strange, so cruel in its arithmetic, that even those who profited from human misery paused to whisper. A woman, 22 years old, was sold for 12 cents. Milledgeville, then the capital of Georgia, pulsed with commerce and cruelty. On market days, streets filled with the cries of livestock, the clatter of wagons, and the muffled voices of buyers inspecting human beings as if they were furniture. The courthouse square doubled as a slave block. Auctioneers with polished boots and booming voices stood above rows of trembling captives. Behind them, planters and creditors scribbled notes, deciding who would live and who would be separated forever. Amid this noise and dust, a single entry in a ledger would quietly defy logic. Lot 27, female, age 22, mulatto, with child, 12C. To understand the significance of that number, one must grasp what the trade had become by that time. The 1830s were the height of what historians later called the Second Middle Passage, a mass internal trade that uprooted over 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South. Cotton was gold and human beings were its miners. A strong young man could fetch over $1,000. A woman in good health might bring $600 or $700. Even infants once weaned had a calculable price. Yet 12 cents was less than the cost of a pound of tobacco. It was a sum so small it mocked the very market it served. Something about this sale was not merely exploitative, it was symbolic. It said that this woman was not being sold for her labor, her strength, or her future children. She was being sold to erase her. The ledger that recorded the transaction belonged to the Brantley estate, one of the largest plantations in Baldwin County. The Brantleys were known for their immense cotton yields and their debts. By 1838, Colonel Matthew Brantley's finances had collapsed under speculation losses, forcing him to liquidate his assets. For 3 days, the Brantley plantation became a marketplace. Families were torn apart under the watchful eye of men in broad hats and wool coats. Witnesses later described the cries that filled the air, mothers calling for children, husbands promising to find wives again, children too young to understand why their hands were being pulled away. When Sarah, Lot 27, was brought forward, silence fell. She was light-skinned, her features bearing traces of mixed ancestry that whispered of the unspoken. Her belly, round and heavy, revealed that she was late in pregnancy. The auctioneer hesitated before reading her name. Female 22, mulatto, with child. His voice faltered on the last 2 words. Usually, pregnant women were valued for the potential of an additional child to be born into servitude. But not this one. The men in the crowd exchanged glances. They knew something. The colonel's eldest son, Thomas, was 20. He stood on the edge of the platform, avoiding her eyes. When the auctioneer called for bids, no one spoke. Even in a world that had normalized buying people, this sale felt contaminated. Then a stranger stepped forward, a thin man in a gray coat, face shadowed by his hat. 12 cents, he said. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer tried to wave him off. We start at 50, but the man didn't move. He dropped a small pouch onto the table. Coins spilled out, tarnished, worn, almost black with age. 12 cents, he repeated. The colonel nodded once, his jaw clenched. The gavel came down. The ledger clerk dipped his pen, scratched the amount, and stamped it with the estate seal. Sold. Lot 27 was led away, clutching her belly, eyes hollow and fixed on the horizon. The crowd dispersed quickly. To them, it was over, a transaction too uncomfortable to dwell on. But the meaning of that number echoed. 12 cents meant she was worth almost nothing, but it also meant she could be disposed of quietly. No serious trader would question a loss that small. No creditor would ask where she went. Her low price granted invisibility. Outside the courthouse, the heat pressed down like a weight. The woman's wrists were bound with coarse rope. The stranger guided her to a wagon covered with canvas. Witnesses remembered that he did not speak, not even when she stumbled. Some thought he was a bounty man, others a hired overseer tasked with cleaning up the colonel's domestic matters. The wagon rolled east, following the Oconee River. A preacher passing on horseback saw it disappear into the pines. In his diary he wrote, "A woman heavy with child, taken east under guard. No name, no kin, no trace." The next morning the Brantley auction resumed. Slaves were sold, debts settled, fields reassigned. By evening, the colonel's household was emptied of servants. His wife avoided the windows, her face pale, her hands trembling over a Bible. The colonel's son, Thomas, spent that night drinking at the tavern. When asked about the girl, he claimed not to remember her name. Yet a servant overheard him whisper, "She took my name with her." Milledgeville's records tell nothing more. But letters discovered years later hint that the 12-cent sale was no accident. A neighboring planter wrote in coded language, "The colonel has resolved his household embarrassment." The sum was symbolic, a closing of accounts. That phrase, closing of accounts, was a euphemism. It meant someone had been removed quietly, outside the law. Slave owners often buried such acts under the guise of trade, marking down impossible prices to disguise what were, in truth, disappearances. 12 cents also revealed something chilling about the system itself. It showed how the machinery of slavery could turn morality inside out. The market had rules, prices, and ledgers to give the illusion of order. But beneath that order lurked an abyss where human worth could be erased by a stroke of a pen. Sarah's sale wasn't about commerce, it was about silence. The price was low because the goal wasn't profit, it was obliteration. In the years that followed, stories about her circulated among the enslaved. Some said she was taken to the river and never seen again. Others claimed she gave birth in the woods, the baby still and quiet before she herself collapsed. There were whispers of a shallow grave by the water, unmarked and soon forgotten. But there were also rumors that a baby survived, that it had pale eyes and a faint birthmark on its temple, just like the Brantley line. That child, some believed, was smuggled into a neighboring household, raised as an orphan, and lived to adulthood never knowing whose blood ran through its veins. The 1838 sale of a woman for 12 cents did not make headlines. It wasn't recorded in newspapers or sermons, but among those who dealt in the trade, it became a grim legend, a moment when the illusion of humanity within the market collapsed entirely. Traders prided themselves on being men of business, claiming they treated slaves as capital, not cruelty. But 12 cents stripped away that pretense. It revealed the true face of ownership, the ability not only to sell a person's body but to erase their existence for less than the price of a nail. Her name was Sarah, though her true name has been lost to the silence of ledgers and the smoke of burned records. What remains is a faint outline. A young woman of 22, born into bondage, living on the Brantley plantation in Georgia's humid heartland. The plantation stretched over thousands of acres of red clay soil, bordered by cypress swamps and the slow, brown veins of the Oconee River. Life there moved to the rhythm of the overseer's whip and the endless demands of cotton. The slaves were woken before dawn by the clang of a cracked bell, worked under the blistering sun, and returned to the quarters at dusk, bodies sore, voices low, faith clinging to whatever songs they could whisper without being punished. Sarah was among them, but her story carried a quiet fracture, something invisible that would later doom her to the cruelest sale in Georgia's history. She was not born on the Brantley estate. Her earliest records trace back to a small farm in Hancock County, where her mother was a domestic servant and her father unknown. At 15, she was sold to Colonel Matthew Brantley, a man in his 50s who saw himself as a patriarch rather than a tyrant, though those who lived under him knew better. His plantation was not merely a place of work, it was a self-contained world ruled by fear. He kept meticulous books recording everything from crop yields to punishments, baptisms, and births among the enslaved. To him, every life had a purpose only if it contributed to his ledger's balance. Sarah's arrival was noted without sentiment. Female, 15 years, mulatto, sound condition, $300. From that moment, her identity was no longer hers. The Brantley household was vast and full of contradictions. The main house stood tall, whitewashed and proud, its columns gleaming under the Georgia sun. Behind it, hidden from polite view, were the quarters, rows of wooden shacks, damp and dim, filled with the smells of smoke, sweat, and soil. In the evenings, after the day's labor, Sarah often worked in the main house as a maid. She cleaned the silver, drew water for baths, and attended to the colonel's guests. Her light complexion and calm demeanor made her the preferred servant for delicate tasks. But proximity to the master's house was a double-edged sword. It carried the illusion of privilege and the certainty of danger. Colonel Brantley had a reputation that trailed him through the county, a man of means, but also of appetites. His wife, sickly and withdrawn, spent her days confined to the parlor, while her husband's gaze lingered too long on the young women who served him. Sarah's presence did not go unnoticed. By the time she was 17, the colonel began assigning her to duties that required her presence after nightfall. There were whispers among the older women, warnings spoken softly so the overseer wouldn't hear. But on a plantation, warnings did little to stop what power demanded. Months later, Sarah was moved from the quarters to a small room above the kitchen, officially to assist with domestic duties. It was the same euphemism used in countless households across the South, an invisible mark that meant ownership extended far beyond labor. By the age of 22, Sarah was carrying a child. Her belly had begun to show in the late winter of 1838, and though the women in the quarters tried to shield her from the overseer's scrutiny, secrets could not stay hidden long. The colonel's wife noticed first. A scene unfolded in the parlor one afternoon, witnessed only by a maid who later recounted it in fragments. The colonel's wife accused Sarah in a trembling voice, demanded to know whose child it was, and when the answer was met with silence, she collapsed. Later that night, the colonel's son, Thomas, barely 20 himself, was seen arguing with his father outside. He shouted something about sin and blood, then stormed away. The next morning, the orders were given. Sarah would be sold, but selling a pregnant woman was not simple. The market treated such women as liabilities, unable to work, uncertain to survive childbirth. Buyers preferred strength and fertility, not scandal. Still, the colonel insisted. His overseer warned him that she would fetch almost nothing. The colonel's reply, recorded in a surviving letter, was chilling in its brevity. "I am not selling her for profit." With that, Sarah's fate was sealed. She was taken from the plantation before dawn, her wrists tied loosely with rope, escorted by 2 men to Milledgeville, where auctions were held twice a month. The auction yard smelled of dust and molasses. Dozens of people stood in line, branded with chalk numbers on their backs. Some were children barely old enough to walk. Sarah stood apart, her swollen stomach making her posture awkward, her expression unreadable. The auctioneer hesitated before calling her name, knowing that few would bid. But before he could begin, a man stepped forward from the crowd. He was thin, gray-coated, and unfamiliar to the regular traders. He placed 12 cents on the table and said nothing. Laughter erupted, bitter, mocking. Someone shouted that she wasn't worth the trouble of hauling away. But the colonel, standing at a distance, simply nodded. The sale was completed in under a minute. The gavel struck, and the ledger clerk recorded it with ink that would outlast every person present that day. Witnesses recalled how the stranger led her away without a word. Some believed he was an agent sent to carry out a quiet task. Others thought he might have been hired to remove a problem. Sarah's face was expressionless, but her hands clutched at her belly as though she could protect what was inside her from the world. The wagon that took her rolled eastward, disappearing into the trees. A preacher passing by later wrote of seeing a covered cart and a woman within, eyes closed as if already gone. No one ever saw her again. The story of her 12-cent sale spread among the enslaved communities like a ghost tale. People spoke of it at night, their voices trembling not just with fear but with understanding. They knew that such a sale was never about money. It was about erasure. It meant that a secret too dangerous to acknowledge had been buried under the pretense of commerce. The colonel's debts were cleared within the year, and his household carried on as if nothing had happened. His wife withdrew further into silence, and his son left for Savannah, never to return. Years later, when the Civil War ended and emancipation came, freedmen searched through plantation records trying to find lost relatives. Among the fragments of the Brantley estate ledger was the entry that read, Lot 27, female, 22 mulatto with child, 12C. There was no buyer's name, no transfer of ownership, no record of delivery, just the number and a faint mark beside it, an X, drawn not by the clerk's hand, but later perhaps by someone who wanted to ensure that the record was not forgotten. Historians who studied the entry decades later debated its meaning. Some believed it signified a hidden murder disguised as a sale. Others thought the child may have been taken and passed off as white, explaining the need to erase the mother from existence altogether. Whatever the truth, the 12 cents had done its work. It had transformed a life into a silence. Sarah's existence, though nearly erased, reveals the unspoken horror of that system. How power could use the mechanics of trade to disguise the destruction of a person. The auctioneer's gavel gave the illusion of legality. The coins gave the illusion of transaction. But beneath those illusions was the reality of a crime that could never be recorded, only whispered. For generations after, local stories told of a woman's cry heard near the river on stormy nights, a sound that rose and fell like the wind through cypress trees. Some said it was only a myth, born from guilt and memory. Yet every time someone opened the old plantation ledger and saw that impossible number, 12 cents, they paused. Because even without names or graves, that price told everything about the world that created it, and the woman who paid its cost. The day she was sold, Sarah was already 7 months pregnant. The weight of the child inside her slowed her steps, but she did not resist when they bound her wrists with rope. She had lived long enough under the Brantley roof to understand that disobedience only prolonged pain. The overseer who led her to the wagon avoided her eyes, muttering something about debts and God's will. She said nothing. Her body ached from the summer heat, her ankles swollen, her skin glistening with sweat. In her mind, fragments of the past collided with the rhythm of the horse's hooves, the soft laughter of Thomas Brantley in the darkened hallways, the whispered promises that had turned to silence, and the night she realized she was carrying his child. It had begun with confusion, not consent. Thomas was different from his father, or so she thought. He was young, awkward, kind in small ways, offering her leftover bread when others weren't looking, asking if she could read, speaking to her like she was more than property. Those moments, rare and fragile, made her guard lower. The boundary between master and slave was a wall of iron, but kindness could disguise itself as something else, something that blurred the lines between pity and possession. The first night he came to her room above the kitchen, she froze. He told her to stay quiet, that no one could know. When he left, he promised to protect her. But promises meant nothing in a world where even her own body wasn't hers to keep. By the time she began to show, he had stopped visiting, afraid of his father's suspicion. And when the colonel discovered the truth, fear turned into fury. Matthew Brantley's rage was cold and deliberate. His plantation ran on order, hierarchy, and bloodlines that were never meant to mix. The idea that his son had fathered a child with a slave woman was a humiliation beyond forgiveness. In his mind, Sarah's pregnancy wasn't just scandal, it was contamination. To acknowledge the child was to admit impurity into a lineage that prided itself on white respectability. Within the walls of the Brantley mansion, silence settled like dust. His wife wept in her parlor, clutching a rosary she barely remembered how to pray. His son stayed away for days, drinking at a tavern near the river, unable to face what he had done. And Sarah, confined to her small room, waited for the punishment she knew would come. On plantations across the South, the bodies of enslaved women were tools of production. Their children were counted as future labor, their fertility a resource to be managed. But Sarah's child was different. It wasn't a future field hand, it was a living confession of sin. The colonel couldn't beat her. The bruises would be visible at auction. He couldn't kill her outright. Rumors spread quickly, and scandal was a greater threat to a Southern gentleman than murder. So he chose a quieter solution. He would sell her, erase her, and with her erase the proof of his son's weakness. When the overseer suggested that no trader would buy a pregnant woman, The colonel replied, "Then let her be bought for nothing. It will be worth every cent." That cent, those 12 of them, were chosen deliberately. It was not a price, but a message. In the logic of the slave market, every figure carried meaning. To mark her value so low was to make her invisible in the eyes of the system itself. 12 cents was beneath commerce, beneath notice. It declared her existence void. When the auctioneer called her name in Milledgeville, he hesitated before speaking the sum. Even among men who trafficked in flesh, the transaction was obscene. Some laughed, some spat, some turned away. But the colonel, standing in the back of the crowd, did not flinch. He watched as the stranger in the gray coat stepped forward, dropped the dull coins on the table, and took the rope from the auctioneer's hand. No one asked where he came from or where he was taking her. In that silence, the truth hid easily. The wagon that carried her away followed the river road, passing through pine forests and fields heavy with cotton. The sun beat down, insects droned, and the world blurred in waves of heat. Sarah leaned against the wooden side of the cart, her wrists still bound, her thoughts circling the same question. Would her child survive? In the final months, she had felt the baby move, gentle flutters at first, then sharp, insistent kicks. She had started speaking to it softly when she was alone, calling it Little One, promising that someday it would be free. But as the wagon rolled farther from the plantation, her hope began to fade. She didn't know where she was being taken, or if she would ever see another sunrise. The man driving the wagon said little. His hands were scarred, his face sunburned, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. At one point, when the horse stumbled, he turned and offered her a sip of water from a tin cup. His voice when he spoke was flat. "Best keep quiet, that was all." She nodded. Hours passed in silence. As night fell, they reached the banks of the Oconee River. The air cooled, and the world turned blue under the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The man pulled the horse to a stop near the trees and climbed down. He untied her wrists but kept his distance. "Walk," he said. She obeyed. What happened next lived only in rumor. Some said he led her to the edge of the water and told her to pray. Others claimed she ran, her swollen body moving through the reeds like a shadow, before a single gunshot echoed across the river. There were no records, no witnesses, no burial. By morning, the wagon was seen returning alone, its canvas still drawn. The man in gray rode straight to the Brantley estate, handed the colonel a folded paper, and left without a word. The colonel placed the paper in his desk and never spoke of it again. The 12-cent entry in his ledger was all that remained. Months later, plantation gossip turned to ghost stories. A field hand swore he saw a woman near the river at dusk, holding a baby wrapped in cloth. Others claimed to hear a woman's cry carried on the wind after rainstorms. The overseer dismissed it as superstition, but even he refused to walk near the water after dark. The colonel's son, racked with guilt, left Georgia entirely. In Savannah, he lived quietly, never marrying, haunted by a past that followed him in dreams. On his deathbed years later, a nurse overheard him mumbling. She was singing to him. I still hear it. For historians, the horror of Sarah's story lies not just in her death, but in what it revealed about the system that allowed it. Slavery depended on control, over bodies, over narratives, over what was seen and what was buried. The birth of a mixed-race child shattered that control. It exposed the intimacy of violence, the blurred line between ownership and violation. Slave owners liked to believe they could keep those lines clean, that their power was paternal, even noble. But every child born from such unions was proof of hypocrisy, a living contradiction to the myth of white supremacy they built their world upon. And so, like Sarah, many women were erased to protect that illusion. In the plantation's accounting books, numbers were cold but precise. Each line represented a life reduced to digits, every figure a mask for something human. Lot 27, female 22, mulatto, with child 12C. The clerk who wrote it likely never questioned its meaning. To him, it was simply another entry. Yet within that line lay a crime so deep it slipped beneath the reach of law or memory. The 12 cents were the cost of silence, an amount chosen to ensure that no one would ever ask what truly happened to the woman carrying her owner's child. The night the sale took place, the sky above the plantation was a lid of heavy, unmoving gray, and the air carried the stench of rain and sweat and despair. The year was 1856, deep in the Cotton Belt South, where human life could be measured in dollars, or in this case, cents. The woman stood at the center of the small wooden stage, her wrists bound loosely with frayed rope, her head bowed but her back unbroken. She was no longer called by her name. On the ledger beside the auctioneer, she was listed only as female, 23, expecting. A crowd had gathered, not in grandeur, but in grim routine. The men wore coats spattered with field dust, their faces drawn and businesslike, as if buying a life was no more unusual than purchasing a plow. They murmured among themselves, glancing at her stomach, small, barely rounded, yet enough to mark her as both lesser and valuable, in ways that twisted morality could justify. A pregnant slave, they said, could double her worth or have it, depending on who was buying. Some wanted workers, some wanted breeders, some wanted neither. They wanted silence. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the stagnant air. He spoke quickly, as if he could outrun the sin in his words. He described her like livestock, healthy limbs, clear eyes, strong back, fertile. The child inside her was reduced to potential profit. There were no mentions of the man who had put it there, but everyone knew. It was common knowledge, whispered but never confronted, that her previous owner, a wealthy planter with silver hair and a wife who prayed loudly every Sunday, had used her body as if it were part of the estate. When the bidding began, no one seemed eager. A few coins clinked, a few numbers were muttered, but there was no true competition. The sight of her pregnancy deterred most. She was no longer convenient for labor, not until months had passed. And yet at the back of the crowd a man raised his hand. He was not rich, not known, just a drifter of sorts, someone who had traded his way through counties, surviving on cunning and cruelty. He offered 12 cents. The crowd laughed, thinking it a joke, but the auctioneer, tired and desperate to move on, slammed the gavel. Sold, 12 cents. The sound of that word echoed through the room like a curse. For less than the price of a loaf of bread, a woman's body, her unborn child, her history, her future, were handed over. The man approached the stage with a slow swagger. He took the rope from the auctioneer and yanked her forward. She stumbled but caught herself before falling. Her eyes lifted for the first time, meeting his, a dull grayish stare that betrayed no empathy. There was no triumph in his face, only ownership. He didn't care that she was pregnant. In truth, he didn't even want her for work. He wanted control, the cruel, intoxicating power of knowing he could own someone for less than a handful of coins. The crowd dispersed, muttering about the absurdity of it all. But beneath their laughter, an unease festered. Even in a time when slavery was normalized, something about this felt grotesque, almost blasphemous. The local preacher's wife refused to walk past the auction block for weeks, saying it smelled of damnation. The ledger clerk, who had written the transaction, burned his copy a month later, fearing that God might remember the ink on his hands. The new owner brought her to a remote patch of land. Not a plantation, not even a proper farm, just a dilapidated cabin surrounded by dying trees. There were no other slaves, no overseers, no neighbors. The isolation was deliberate. Here no one would question him. No one would see. She worked the fields alone, her body weakening as her belly grew. He gave her little food, less kindness, and spoke to her only when issuing commands. Sometimes when night fell and the cicadas screamed, she would sit by the small window, staring at the moon. She didn't speak, but her eyes carried something more powerful than words, a defiance that refused to die. Somewhere within her, the memory of her past master's house still lived. The scent of magnolias, the sound of piano from the parlor, and the bitter memory of hands that claimed her under the pretense of ownership. Her child was a consequence of that violence, but also, she believed, a chance for something else, a continuation that no man could erase. Rumors began to spread months later. Travelers passing through the county spoke of strange cries in the night, of a man who had gone mad with guilt, and of a woman seen walking the fields barefoot, whispering to her unborn child. Local superstition turned the story into legend. They said she had cursed the 12-cent coin, that it had become a mark of divine reckoning. Some even claimed to find such a coin buried near the creek, etched faintly with the initials of her first master, though no one could explain how or why. The truth, however, was darker and far simpler. Her new owner had become paranoid. He began hearing voices, or perhaps they were memories. The whispers of the crowd laughing at him for buying her so cheap, the echo of the auctioneer's gavel sealing his shame. He drank heavily, muttering to himself that she was worth more than that, as if trying to convince the ghosts. One stormy night, when the wind howled through the cracks of the cabin and lightning lit the fields, she went into labor. The child came into the world silently, its first breath stolen by the weight of the storm and the cruelty of fate. The man, delirious with drink, stared at her and said she was cursed, that for 12 cents he had bought damnation itself. By morning, both she and the child were gone. Some say she walked into the woods and never returned. Others claimed she buried the infant beneath the largest oak tree and vanished into the marsh. No one knows what truly happened. The man was found days later, hanging from the rafters of his cabin, the 12-cent coin clenched between his teeth. In the years that followed, people avoided that land. Farmers who tried to reclaim it said the soil never grew crops. The tools rusted overnight, and that sometimes, in the early dawn, they could see a woman's silhouette moving through the fog, cradling something small in her arms. The story became a warning whispered across generations about greed, cruelty, and the price of reducing a soul to numbers. But beyond superstition, buried beneath the dirt and memory, lies the haunting truth. Somewhere in America's forgotten history, a woman was sold for 12 cents, pregnant with the child of the man who enslaved her. Her name was erased, her story nearly lost, and yet her shadow lingers. A reminder that even in a world built on silence, some horrors refuse to stay buried. The birth of the child was supposed to be a quiet event, one that would pass unnoticed, like so many other births that took place in the shadowed corners of the South. But this one was different. It happened in the middle of a thunderstorm that seemed to tear open the heavens. The woman, exhausted and drenched in sweat, labored alone on the dirt floor of the cabin, her breath shallow and uneven. The man who owned her, the one who had paid 12 cents for her life, sat outside, drunk, staring at the dark trees as lightning flashed across the horizon. Each flash illuminated the cabin's crooked walls and the faint cries from within, sounds that seemed to grow weaker, then desperate, then silent. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the silence that remained was heavier than thunder. The woman wrapped her newborn in a piece of torn cloth, her movements slow, deliberate. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell faintly, alive but fragile. She looked at the child and saw the same cruel contradiction that had defined her life. Innocence born of sin, hope born from violation. She did not weep. Her tears had dried long ago, back on the plantation where her freedom had been first stolen. She whispered to the infant, telling it stories that only she would remember, about the river near her mother's home, about the songs sung by the women while working the fields, about how she had once dreamed of learning to read. Before someone decided she was worth only 12 cents, she told the child that they would not remain there, that the world beyond those trees was vast and cruel, but at least it was theirs to find. She knew that staying meant death, whether slow or sudden. And so, before the sun had fully risen, she gathered what little she could carry, pressed the child against her chest, and began to walk. The forest swallowed her whole. Her bare feet sank into the wet earth, leaving faint prints that the wind quickly erased. The path ahead was uncertain. She didn't know the way north, didn't know where freedom began or ended. But she moved with the quiet strength of someone who has already lost everything that can be taken. The trees loomed tall and twisted, their branches like outstretched hands, and somewhere in the distance, wolves howled as if mourning something unseen. By nightfall, she reached a stream and collapsed beside it. The child slept fitfully, its small fingers gripping the edge of her torn dress. She drank from the water, cold and metallic, and looked at her reflection. For a moment she barely recognized herself. Hollow eyes, blood-matted hair, skin marked with the bruises of labor and cruelty. But beneath that, there was something fierce still burning, a quiet, relentless will to survive, to defy the world that had reduced her to a transaction. In the days that followed, the woman and her child became ghosts of the woods. Travelers would later claim they saw a figure in white moving between the trees, carrying something close to her heart. She scavenged for berries, dug roots from the earth, and kept the baby warm by the fire she built from fallen branches. But her strength was fading. The child's cries grew softer, its breath shallower with each passing night. She began to speak to it less as a mother and more as if she were preparing it for something beyond, whispering prayers she barely remembered, hoping that some god somewhere was listening. Back at the cabin, the man who had bought her awoke 3 days later to find her gone. At first he raged, overturning tables, shouting into the emptiness. But as the night deepened, his anger turned to fear. He began hearing things, footsteps outside the cabin, whispers that came from nowhere, the faint sound of a baby crying in the distance. He told himself it was the wind, or guilt, or the whiskey, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, calm, silent, unyielding, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. The coin he'd used to buy her burned in his pocket like a brand. He couldn't throw it away. It felt heavier than metal, as if it carried the weight of the entire world's sin. Rumors spread quickly through the nearby towns. Some said the woman had escaped north and joined a network of abolitionists, her child growing up to tell her story. Others said she had drowned herself and the baby in the river to spare them both from being found. A few believed something stranger, that she had cursed the man who bought her, and that her spirit haunted anyone who touched a 12-cent coin. Whatever the truth, no one who lived near that cabin ever stayed long. The crops refused to grow, livestock disappeared, and travelers who passed by at night spoke of a woman's voice drifting through the woods, humming lullabies that turned to wails. One day, a boy from a nearby farm wandered into those woods, chasing a lost goat. When he returned, pale and trembling, he told his mother he had seen a woman kneeling by a shallow grave, her hands pressed over a bundle of cloth. She looked up at him and smiled, not cruelly, not sadly, just with the kind of peace that comes from knowing something others cannot. When the mother went to look, she found nothing but a hollow in the earth and a single silver coin glinting in the dirt. Years passed, and the story became part of the local folklore. People began calling her the 12-cent mother. Some said she protected lost children. Others claimed she punished cruel men. A century later, when the Civil War had come and gone, and slavery was officially condemned, the legend remained. A quiet, uncomfortable reminder that the end of a law does not erase the sins that birthed it. Historians would later find fragments of documents, a plantation ledger, a torn receipt, and a baptismal record for a child with no listed father, dated the same year. But there was no grave, no record of her death, and no confirmation of the baby's fate. The woman who had been sold for 12 cents seemed to vanish completely, swallowed by history. Yet every retelling of her story felt like a rebellion against the silence that tried to erase her. Her name might be lost, but her defiance survived, carried in the whispers of the forests, in the unease of those who heard her tale and could not sleep. In the old towns of Georgia and Mississippi, people still avoid coins from that era when they find them, especially if they bear the worn-out numbers 1856. They say holding one too long makes your hands feel cold, as if something unseen is reaching through time to remind you that even the smallest coin once bought a life. And sometimes, when storms roll in over the cotton fields, the wind sounds almost human. A woman's voice, faint but steady, carrying a lullaby meant for a child who never got to grow up in a free world. Decades passed, but the soil where she had once stood seemed to remember everything. The land itself carried a weight that words could not describe. The cabin rotted and collapsed, but the foundation stones remained, half buried beneath moss and vines. Locals avoided it, claiming that strange things happened there. Animals refused to graze, fires would not light, and the air itself felt colder than it should. Some said that when the wind passed through the trees just right, you could hear the faint cry of a child, or the sound of a woman's voice humming a song that had no melody anyone could name. Others said it wasn't haunting, it was history refusing to be forgotten. By the late 1800s, the world had changed, at least on paper. The war had ended, and with it came proclamations of freedom. But in the Deep South, freedom was a word spoken softly, half believed. For people like her, for those whose names were never written, only priced, the change came too late. Yet her story lingered. Old men told it around fires, warning their sons about the curse of cheap sin, and women whispered it to their daughters as a prayer for protection. In 1892, a preacher passing through the area stopped near the ruined cabin to rest. He was young, idealistic, full of conviction about saving souls. But as he unpacked his satchel, he noticed something strange. The ground beneath his feet felt hollow, as if the earth itself was breathing. He brushed away the leaves and found a rusted iron ring buried in the dirt. When he pulled, the soil gave way, revealing a small wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread. Inside were two things: a tiny cloth bundle, disintegrating with time, and a tarnished coin. 12 cents. The preacher didn't understand what he'd found, not fully. But when he held the coin, he felt a chill crawl up his spine, a weight pressing down on him as if generations were watching. That night he wrote in his journal, "I fear this place holds the sin of many, and it speaks through silence." He reburied the box and left at dawn, never preaching in that town again. His entry would later be found in a forgotten church archive, long after his death. The locals had their own theories about the coin. Some believed it was cursed, that anyone who found it would be haunted by visions of chains and blood and crying infants. Others said it was sacred, a relic of redemption, proof that God had seen her suffering and marked the land as holy. Whichever they believed, none dared to touch it. The earth covered it again, layer by layer, until it became part of the landscape, an unmarked grave that grew wildflowers in spring. Time kept moving. The civil rights era came, and people marched through those same southern roads demanding justice that should have been granted a century before. One day, in 1964, a journalist researching forgotten plantations came across the story. She had found an old ledger in a courthouse archive. Its ink faded but legible enough to read one haunting line. Sold, female. A3 expecting, 12th ISO. There was no name. No signature, just that transaction. The journalist became obsessed. She visited the area, interviewed the elders, pieced together the fragments of oral history. One woman, nearly 90, told her, "My grandmother used to say she saw her, a lady in white, walking by the creek at dusk, carrying something small. She said if you listen close, you can hear her whispering to her baby." The journalist walked that same path, stood by the same creek and felt something in the air, a heaviness, not fear exactly, but awareness, as if the world around her remembered something she could not see. She wrote her article, not for sensation, but for remembrance. It was titled, "The Woman Worth 12 Cents." It told the story of a nameless enslaved mother, her child, and the cruelty that reduced her humanity to the value of pocket change. The piece ran in a small historical journal, barely noticed at first. But a teacher from Atlanta read it and began including it in her curriculum, telling her students that some parts of history are not written in books. They're whispered through the land, through pain that refuses to die. Years later, archaeologists surveying old plantation routes unearthed fragments of broken pottery, bits of fabric, and a small bone button near the area believed to be where the woman once lived. They found no body, no definitive evidence, but they did find a coin worn thin by time. Its markings were nearly gone, but you could still make out faint letters. A date, 1856. The discovery never made major news, but to those who knew the legend, it was enough. Proof that the story was not myth, not folklore. It had roots. It had weight. By the 21st century, the legend of the 12-cent woman had evolved. Artists painted her image as a faceless mother holding her child against a backdrop of storm clouds. Poets wrote about her as a symbol of all the voices lost to history, the women who carried generations within them yet were denied the dignity of a name. Scholars cited her as a case study in the economics of dehumanization, how entire systems had been built on reducing human souls to profit margins. But beyond all the analysis, the story remained deeply personal. For many descendants of enslaved people, it represented a shared memory, one that could not be traced through records, but lived in the bones. The story of one woman sold for 12 cents was not just hers. It was the echo of thousands. Every plantation ledger with missing names, every auction note with blank spaces, every field that grew cotton over unmarked graves, they were all connected. In some towns, small memorials began to appear. Not official monuments, those rarely came, but quiet gestures. A stone laid near the riverbank, a plaque nailed to an old tree, a coin placed in the soil. No one claimed responsibility for them. They simply appeared, as if guided by unseen hands. People said that on some nights, especially when the air was thick and humid, the coins would shine faintly in the moonlight. Not gold, not silver, but something softer, like the shimmer of forgiveness trying to find its way through time. There's a saying among the elders now: the past don't stay buried, not when it's still owed its name. And perhaps that's true. The land where she walked remains quiet but not empty. The roots twist deep into memory, pulling at what the world tried to forget. The cabin is gone, the field reclaimed by wild grass, but those who go there say they can still feel her presence, not as a ghost, but as a question. The same one that began her story. What is a life worth? The question lingers, carried on the wind, whispered through generations. And every time someone bends to pick up an old coin from the dirt, every time a historian opens a ledger filled with nameless lives, that question stirs again, demanding an answer that history still struggles to give. There are places in America where history feels like a pulse under the earth, faint, irregular, but alive. The land remembers what people forget, and sometimes it forces those memories to the surface. The field where she was sold for 12 cents became one of those places. It looked ordinary, a stretch of grass bordered by oaks, the remains of an old auction block swallowed by weeds. But those who lingered too long swore they felt something beneath their feet, a steady rhythm, like the beating of a heart that refused to stop. By the time the 20th century faded into the 21st, few living souls knew the story in detail. Yet it endured in fragments, a tale told in whispers, a warning passed from grandmother to child. In small southern towns, people spoke of the woman of 12 cents with the same tone they used for church hymns, reverent, careful, as if saying her name too loudly might wake something still grieving. Her story had become both tragedy and scripture, a reminder of how cruelty could be both systemic and intimate. Historians years later would try to piece it together. They'd find fragments, not enough for certainty, but too much for coincidence. A ledger with her sale written in ink that had bled through the page. A plantation account book with an unnamed woman marked, "with child, sent to market." And somewhere, in a private letter between two planters, a line that read, 12 cents was all it took to bury God. No one knew what that meant. But it was enough to suggest that even then, people felt the horror of what had been done, though none dared speak it aloud. The power of her story wasn't in the details, but in what it revealed about silence. For centuries, entire lives had been written out of history, their voices smothered by ledgers and laws. She represented them, not as a single tragedy, but as a collective memory that refused to die. When people spoke her story, they weren't just mourning her. They were acknowledging every woman who bore both the scars and the future of a nation on her back. The story gained new life in the modern era. Activists, artists, and filmmakers began searching for her, not her body, not her bloodline, but her truth. One filmmaker from Louisiana claimed to have found the site of her grave through oral maps passed down by local families. She described walking through a swampy patch of land at dusk, the air thick with humidity, until she reached a clearing where the trees bent toward each other like mourners. There, she said, the soil felt warm to the touch, and in the stillness she heard the faint sound of humming, not eerie but soothing, like a mother's lullaby. She recorded nothing. She said the camera refused to capture it. The batteries drained each time she tried. She left a single white lily on the ground and walked away without looking back. Others approached her story through history. One archivist uncovered records showing that around the time of the woman's disappearance, several slaveholders in the region began petitioning for compensation for lost property, a bureaucratic phrase meant to disguise human lives as assets. But one petition stood out, a man claiming the loss of a female servant and child, both unfit for labor, absconded without reason. The signature on that petition matched the initials carved faintly into the 12-cent coin found years later. That discovery changed everything. The coin was no longer just an artifact of superstition, it was a document of guilt. It connected the man, the sale, and the crime. And it gave historians something they had long sought, proof that her story was real. Universities began referencing her in academic studies on slavery, gender, and power. Museums built exhibits dedicated to lives without names, and her section drew the longest lines. Visitors stood before her display, A simple case containing the coin, a broken chain, and a description with no portrait. And many of them wept. For descendants of the enslaved, she became a symbol of endurance. They left notes by her display. Prayers, letters, promises. One read, "You were worth more than the world could afford." Another said, "Your baby lived, through all of us." The museum curators kept the letters, adding new ones each year. They said it wasn't about closure. It was about connection, a way of saying that even if history erased her name, her presence had shaped everything that came after. But beyond the academic halls and museums, her story lived differently. In the small towns where it began, the legend evolved. Locals spoke of a woman seen walking the roads at dusk during storm season, her dress white as bone, her arms cradling something invisible. Those who saw her said she didn't bring fear, only silence. It was said that if you stopped and bowed your head, she would vanish. But if you ignored her, misfortune would follow. Crops would die, sickness would come, or the river would flood. Some said she wasn't a ghost at all. She was a conscience, a reminder sent to the living not to forget the cost of their comfort. There was one man, a historian from Virginia, who made it his life's mission to uncover her name. He spent 20 years traveling between archives, courthouses, and plantations, gathering fragments of testimony. What he found was devastating in its simplicity. She had likely been born to an enslaved mother on a plantation near the Alabama border, her father unknown, her body sold 3 times before she turned 20. The man who impregnated her, her owner, never acknowledged her or the child. And the one who bought her for 12 cents? He was later found dead in his cabin, the coin lodged between his teeth. The coroner had called it suicide. The papers never printed the story, the historian never found her name. But before his death, he left a note that read, "Perhaps her name isn't meant to be found. Perhaps her story is her name." That note, too, became part of her legacy. A final reminder that sometimes history preserves people not through identification but through impact. In recent years, schools have begun teaching her story as part of the broader narrative of slavery's hidden crimes. Not the glorified tales of generals and plantations, but the human truth. The quiet, brutal reality of what it meant to be owned, used, and forgotten. Teachers describe her not as a ghost, but as a voice that speaks across centuries, asking one question the world still struggles to answer: how could something so sacred ever be sold? At her site, the field where the auction once stood, a small memorial now rests. It isn't grand, just a stone carved with 12 small dots, one for each cent, arranged in a circle. There's no name, no inscription, only the faint etching of a mother holding her child. People leave coins there, not to pay tribute, but to return the currency of her suffering to the earth that bore witness to it. When the wind passes through the trees, it sounds like a sigh, long, heavy, but almost at peace. And perhaps that's what her story became. Not just a tragedy, but a reckoning. A whisper carried forward to remind every generation that history is not just what was written, but what was endured. The woman sold for 12 cents was more than a victim. She was proof that even when erased, truth finds a way to speak, through the ground, through the ghosts, through the quiet remembrance of those who still listen. If this story made your heart heavy, if it forced you to look at history not as something distant, but as something still echoing inside our world, then don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. These are not just stories of the past. They're reflections of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Every week we uncover another chapter that was never meant to be told: buried confessions, silent witnesses, forbidden documents, and lives erased from record. Behind every name there's a truth that demands to be seen, and here we bring them to light. If you believe history should unsettle you before it teaches you, if you want to stand among those who look at the shadows rather than turn away, then make sure you're part of this journey. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss another hidden story the world tried to forget. Turn on notifications, because what's coming next will shake what you thought you knew about the past. And if this story left you questioning, and why was she sold for 12 cents? Who was truly free? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. Tell me what you felt: anger, sorrow, disbelief, or something deeper. Because the moment we stop talking about these lives, they disappear again. Let's make sure they never do. Subscribe, watch closely. And remember, the truth doesn't fade. It waits.